Canada has just positioned itself at the center of a new NATO financial architecture worth $135 billion, and Washington is only beginning to understand what that means for the alliance it has led for 8 decades. What is Carney building, and why are some of America's closest allies already choosing sides in ways that may reshape the entire Western security order? There is something quietly significant about the man behind this strategy. Mark Carney did not arrive in politics from the usual corridors of parliamentary debate or local government. He came from the institutions that move the world economy. Former governor of the Bank of Canada, former governor of the Bank of England, the only person in history to have held both positions simultaneously for the world's 2 most storied financial institutions. When Carney speaks about capital architecture, about institutional design, about how money flows through alliances, these are not campaign promises or abstract ambitions. They are the language of someone who has actually done it before. That background matters enormously in understanding what is now unfolding. When Canadian voters elected Carney in a political climate shaped in large part by alarm over the United States government's posture toward Canada, including tariff threats, suggestions that Canada might become a 51st American state, and what Carney himself described as the monetization of American hegemony, they were not simply choosing a party leader. They were, whether consciously or not, choosing a particular kind of expertise at a particular kind of moment. And Carney, by almost every observable measure, has chosen to use that expertise aggressively. Within months of taking office, he convened representatives from more than 10 nations to discuss a proposal that had been quietly developing in Brussels and NATO planning circles for years. That proposal now has a name and a number. The Defense, Security and Resilience Bank, known as the DSRB, is designed to raise approximately $135 billion for military and security projects across the NATO alliance and its partners. The bank would be a multilateral institution whose member countries act as owners, providing equity that backs loans, while commercial banks handle the actual lending to defense firms at lower interest rates because the loans would be guaranteed by the institution itself. It is, in structural terms, a defense-focused version of the World Bank, designed to pool the credit strength of allied nations and redirect it toward the rearmament the alliance increasingly believes it needs. The question this raises, and the one that has drawn careful attention in Washington, is simple. If allies can finance their own defense at scale without Washington's participation, what changes about the alliance, and crucially, what changes about Canada's place within it? To understand the weight of what Carney has now set in motion, you need to understand where Canada was before he arrived. For decades, Canada occupied an uncomfortable and somewhat embarrassing position within NATO. The alliance's benchmark for defense spending, set at 2% of gross domestic product, had been a point of consistent friction between Ottawa and Washington, between Ottawa and its European allies, and increasingly between Ottawa and a restless Canadian public that could see its military equipment aging and its Arctic borders thinly defended. Under previous governments, Canada had offered pledges and timelines that stretched out to 2032 and beyond. At NATO summits, Canadian officials faced pointed questions from allies and, notably, from members of the United States Congress on both sides of the aisle, who publicly called out Canada's failure to have any credible plan to meet the benchmark. Canada currently spends approximately 1.37% of its GDP on defence, and the low numbers do not tell the full story. Ottawa had only 1 operational submarine out of 4, and only about half of Canada's maritime and land vehicles were functional. That was the baseline Carney inherited. His response was immediate and, in the context of Canadian political history, unprecedented. He committed Canada to meeting the 2% NATO benchmark by March 2026, a full decade ahead of the previous government's schedule, requiring an investment of between $18 and $20 billion. But he framed this commitment in terms that went far beyond budget arithmetic. Standing before an audience of foreign policy thinkers and national security officials in Toronto, Carney declared that the era of United States dominance on the world stage is over, and that it is time for Canada to chart its own path. He described the current moment as a hinge in history, a phrase he has returned to repeatedly. And then he kept moving. At the NATO summit in The Hague, alongside 31 other member nation leaders, Carney committed Canada to something far more ambitious than the 2% target. NATO members agreed to raise defense-related spending to the equivalent of 5% of their gross domestic product by 2035, structured as 3.5% for direct military spending and 1.5% for defense-related infrastructure. For Canada, meeting that target by 2035 could require spending of approximately $150 billion per year. Economists have noted that much of this new defense spending will need to be debt-financed, as planned tax reductions are already underway while expenditures on other priorities increase. The scale is not a minor adjustment. It is the most significant reorientation of Canadian defense policy since the Second World War. And behind the spending commitments, Carney has been building something more durable than a budget line. He has been building infrastructure. On February 17, 2026, Prime Minister Carney stood at CAE Incorporated in Montreal, a leading Canadian defense technology company, and announced something that Canada had never produced before: a formal defense industrial strategy. The strategy ties procurement, industrial capacity, and national security together in a single structural framework and sets the goal of awarding 70% of federal defense contracts to Canadian firms within a decade. The document amounts to a declaration that Canada's approach to its own security can no longer be what critics have called a branch plant model, whereby the country buys equipment from allies, primarily the United States, rather than developing the domestic capacity to build and maintain its own. Over the next decade, Canada will invest $180 billion directly in defense procurement, $290 billion in defense and security-related infrastructure, and expects to generate over $125 billion in additional downstream economic benefits. The total commitment, Carney said, amounts to over $500 billion across defense and security investment, doubling defense expenditures by the end of this decade, with an additional $80 billion over the next 5 years. The strategy also signals a move towards sovereign control over critical supply chains. China holds a monopoly on some key materials needed for basic military equipment and has shown willingness to restrict exports, a vulnerability now regarded as a matter of national security across the alliance. Canada, as a major producer of critical minerals including tungsten, bismuth, and cobalt, is positioned to address some of that vulnerability, both for itself and for allies. But the announcement landed into a complicated geopolitical moment. Just days before Canada unveiled its strategy prioritizing domestic production, Washington quietly warned the European Union against favoring its own arms makers as it rebuilds, arguing that cutting out American producers ultimately inhibits allies from procuring the capabilities they actually need. Carney downplayed the tension, describing Canadian industry as complementary to American supply rather than competitive with it. But the signal was clear to observers on both sides of the border. Canada is no longer content to simply purchase from Washington. It intends to build. Now comes the piece of Carney's strategy that has drawn the sharpest attention from defense analysts and financial institutions around the world. The Defense, Security and Resilience Bank is not yet fully operational. Its charter is moving through negotiations with parliamentary approval expected by mid-2026 and the institution aiming to begin operations by the end of this year. But the momentum behind it is real, and Canada's fingerprints are on every significant development. Canada has signalled it will work with international partners on the DSRB, with Finance Minister François-Philippe Champagne confirming Canada is playing a leading role in discussions and negotiations after talks with representatives of more than 10 nations. What makes the Canadian involvement structurally important is the country's financial credentials. Canada holds an AAA credit rating, one of only 7 NATO members to do so. That rating is essential for the DSRB's design because the bank needs to pool the credit strength of its strongest members to offer other nations lower borrowing costs. Brigadier General Robbie Boyd, a senior advisor to the DSRB Development Group and former principal military advisor to the NATO Military Committee, has said the bank fits precisely with the vision Carney outlined at Davos and that Canada is likely to serve as a G7 anchor for the institution. The bank's target is ambitious. The DSRB aims to raise roughly $135 billion for military projects, with member countries providing upfront capital and backstop guarantees in a crisis, designed to secure a AAA credit rating that would allow the institution to issue global bonds. And Canada's largest financial institutions have moved quickly. All 6 of Canada's major banks, the Royal Bank of Canada, Toronto-Dominion, Bank of Nova Scotia, Bank of Montreal, CIBC, and National Bank, have signed on as partner banks of the DSRB more than from any other single country. That level of domestic financial commitment signals something beyond rhetoric, but it also opens a question that no one has yet fully answered. What does Washington think of an institution that could allow NATO allies to finance rearmament entirely outside the American financial and industrial system? The United States government's response to Canada's new defense posture has been layered and at times contradictory, a pattern that reflects the broader complexity of the bilateral relationship under present circumstances. On one level, there is genuine approval. US Ambassador to Canada, Pete Hoekstra, told CBC's Power and Politics that Carney's plan to meet the 2% NATO benchmark would make NATO stronger and is a clear indication that things are moving in the right direction. For years, American officials across administrations complained about Canada's failure to carry its share of the collective defense burden. From that perspective, Carney's spending commitments are exactly what Washington has demanded. But the other layer of Washington's reaction is more guarded and, in some respects, more revealing. When Carney announced the Defense Industrial Strategy, with its goal of directing 70% of procurement toward Canadian firms, Washington had already warned the European Union against similar buy-European policies, arguing they would weaken ties between the United States and NATO allies. The warning was not formally directed at Canada, but the implication was understood in Ottawa. If Canada's domestic defense strategy disadvantages American contractors, the Trump administration has demonstrated it is prepared to respond. There is a further tension embedded in the DSRB itself. If the bank eventually provides NATO allies with a mechanism to borrow at scale for rearmament without depending on American-backed institutions, it subtly but meaningfully shifts the financial architecture of the alliance. Analysts have observed that the creation of such an institution would not replace American power, but would do something more structural. It would prepare the non-American Western world to fill a potential power vacuum inside the alliance if Washington steps back or begins conditioning its commitments. That framing, which comes from defense and security analysts rather than from the Carney government directly, captures the strategic logic that makes this moment significant. Canada is not positioning itself against the United States, but it is positioning itself for a scenario in which Washington's leadership of the alliance becomes less predictable. The question of whether Washington will interpret that as prudent contingency planning or as a form of strategic defection is one that will define the relationship between the two countries in the years ahead. There is perhaps no more concrete illustration of how seriously Canada is taking the DSRB than the domestic competition now playing out between its own major cities for the honor of hosting the bank's global headquarters. It has the character of a national moment. Montreal became one of the latest Canadian cities to put its name forward, with Quebec Premier François Legault joining the city's business and political leaders to make the case, describing Montreal's combination of aerospace strength, artificial intelligence capacity, and international organization presence, including nearly 70 international bodies already based in the city, as uniquely suited to host a multilateral defense financing institution. Toronto has pitched its role as the country's financial capital, Ottawa-Gatineau, its proximity to federal institutions and the defense community, and Vancouver its position on the Pacific coast as a strategic advantage offering connectivity between North America, Europe, and the Indo-Pacific. Once operational, potentially by late 2026, the DSRB is expected to include up to 40 member states, and the headquarters is projected to bring approximately 3,500 high-quality jobs to whichever city secures it. The competition itself is notable. It means that Canadian provinces and cities are treating this institution not merely as a government project, but as an economic opportunity of the first order, one worth significant investment and political capital to secure. That level of domestic enthusiasm is precisely what makes the DSRB more than a diplomatic gesture. It is becoming embedded in Canadian economic identity in a way that will be difficult to reverse, regardless of which government holds power in Ottawa. And there is an international dimension to the headquarters competition as well. Luxembourg has been identified as a likely European anchor for the bank, given its role as a major global bond issuer and its hosting of the European Investment Bank, which would help ensure both NATO and EU institutional support for the DSRB. Notably, both Germany and Britain have said they will not back the DSRB in its current form, with Germany arguing that defence financing should run through existing EU mechanisms, and British sources raising concerns that the bank may not meet the UK's goals for defence spending efficiency. That division among NATO's largest European members is significant. It means the DSRB, if it proceeds, will reflect a particular coalition within the alliance rather than NATO consensus, and Canada is at the center of defining what that coalition looks like. To understand the full strategic logic behind everything Carney has built since taking office, it is worth returning to the speech he delivered at the World Economic Forum in Davos in January 2026, because that speech functions as both a diagnosis and a roadmap. Standing before an audience that included some of the world's most influential investors, policymakers, and institutional leaders, Carney used language that was carefully chosen and deliberately precise. He said, "The United States is beginning to monetize its hegemony, charging for access to its markets and reducing its relative contributions to our collective security. In parallel, the world's trade routes, allegiances, energy systems, and even intelligence itself are being rewired." He described middle powers, nations like Canada, France, Germany, and Australia, as countries that must now compete for interests and attention, and he returned to a phrase that has become something of a signature. "If they are not at the table, they will be on the menu." He called the current moment a rupture, not a transition, and said, "You cannot live within the lie of mutual benefit through integration, when integration becomes the source of your subordination." That line was understood by the room as a direct reference to Canada's historically deep and asymmetric economic integration with the United States, an integration in which, as Carney framed it, the benefits to Canada have been real, but have come increasingly with conditions attached. The Davos speech did more than articulate a grievance. It announced a strategy. Carney outlined what Canada had been doing since he took office, signing 12 new trade and security agreements on 4 continents within 6 months, moving toward deeper engagement with European allies, building what he called strategic autonomy, the capacity to say no when necessary. He stated plainly, "It is time for Canada to chart its own path and assert itself on the international stage," with an implicit message to Washington that it should not take for granted Canada's future role in North American defense architecture. The DSRB, the Defense Industrial Strategy, the NATO spending commitments, and the EU partnership are not isolated decisions. They are pieces of a single coherent architecture designed by someone who has spent decades building financial institutions, now applied to the challenge of rebuilding a country's strategic autonomy. The broader implication of Canada's moves is not simply bilateral, it is architectural. The NATO alliance has operated since its founding on a structure in which the United States contributes the preponderance of military and financial power, and allies contribute political credibility and geographic access. That structure has served the alliance well in many respects, but it has also created deep dependencies that, in the current environment, have begun to feel less like partnership and more like vulnerability. NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte, speaking at the Hague summit where the 5% commitment was announced, said it meant European allies and Canada will do more of the heavy lifting and take greater responsibility for our shared security. That phrase, from the Secretary-General himself, is a formal acknowledgement that the balance of responsibility within the alliance is shifting. Canada's push to anchor the DSRB, to lead its capitalization, and to serve as a G7 underwriter for the institution represents an attempt to shape where that shift leads. A strong majority of Canadians surveyed support the increased military spending, even if it comes at the expense of social programs or requires higher taxes, with only 17% opposing the higher defense budget. A significant driver of that public sentiment is reported to be distrust in the United States under the current administration's leadership. That political dynamic matters because it means Carney is not operating against public opinion. He has a mandate, and that mandate has given him the room to make commitments that would have been politically difficult for any previous Canadian government. The question that analysts and policymakers in Washington are now examining is whether this represents a strengthening of the alliance's overall capabilities or a gradual decoupling of the non-American members from American leadership. It is honestly possible that the answer is both. An alliance in which Canada can finance its own rearmament, source from its own defense industry, and participate in a multilateral lending institution that operates outside the American financial system is an alliance less dependent on Washington's goodwill. That is, by one reading, exactly what the United States has long demanded, allies that can stand on their own feet. But it is also, by another reading, an alliance in which American leverage over allied decision-making has been meaningfully reduced. As with any strategy of this ambition and speed, the questions that remain open are at least as important as the commitments already made. Canada's defence industrial strategy has drawn pointed criticism from experts who note that the goal of sourcing 70% of procurement from domestic firms is aspirational in a country where the defence industry has for decades operated as what one former NATO official called a branch plant economy. Wendy Gilmore, a Canadian and former Assistant Secretary-General for Defence Investment at NATO, told CBC News there is nothing in the strategy that guarantees Canada will stop being dependent on international suppliers for core military capabilities. Building a sovereign defence industrial base capable of supplying submarines, advanced fighters, satellite systems, and autonomous weapons platforms takes not years but decades, and requires sustained political commitment that crosses election cycles. Canada's defence procurement has been described as the country's persistent weakness for decades, and experts question whether it can be reformed at the pace and scale Carney's commitments require. On the DSRB itself, the institutional path is not yet fully cleared. With Germany and Britain outside the coalition, the bank will need to demonstrate that it can achieve its AAA rating and mobilise capital at the scale needed without the participation of two of NATO's largest economies. The bank aims to begin operations by the end of 2026, secure its top credit rating by 2027, and then issue global bonds. But each of those steps depends on diplomatic and financial conditions that are not yet locked in. And then there is the question that underlies everything: whether the current trajectory in Canada-US relations stabilizes, deteriorates further, or finds a new equilibrium that neither country has yet fully defined. What is verifiable is this: Canada has committed, for the first time in its modern history, to a rate of defence spending increase last seen during the mobilization for the Second World War. It has published a national defence industrial strategy. It has mobilized all 6 of its major banks behind a multilateral institution designed to finance Allied rearmament. It has committed to 5% of GDP on defence and security by 2035, and it is actively lobbying to host the headquarters of the DSRB on Canadian soil. Washington now faces the task of deciding how to respond to an ally that is, in concrete institutional terms, building the architecture of an alliance that depends less on American financial and industrial dominance than it has for 80 years. That response, or the absence of one, will shape the Western security order for the decades ahead. What Mark Carney has set in motion is documented, measurable, and moving fast. The commitments are on the record, the bank is being built, the strategy is published, and the money is being aligned behind it. Whether the execution can match the ambition is a genuine and open question, but the direction is clear, and in every capital of the alliance people are paying attention. The outcome will not be decided in a single summit or a single speech. It will be decided in procurement contracts, parliamentary votes, credit ratings, and the quiet choices of allied governments about where to place their trust. That process is already underway, and its conclusion will define what NATO looks like for the next generation.